Bibsy Squad, welcome back to another episode of Biblically Serious, where we're all about understanding the Bible and owning our faith. It is Women's History Month, and what that means is it's a great time to reflect and to appreciate all the incredible work of amazing women throughout time and throughout the world. It's also a really good time to learn more about women in the Bible. This month, we'll look at 3 passages about women, and we will interpret them, and we will think about how does this apply to us today in our identity and our roles in society and in the church. Last week, we talked about the daughters of Zelophehad in Numbers 27. So if you didn't see that, be sure to check it out. But this week, we are going to be talking about SAPPHIRA in Acts 5. Let's get started. So Acts 4 ends with describing the communal and generous nature of the early church in Israel. It says, "Now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of those things that belonged to him was his own. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to as each had need." After describing the generosity of the early believers, it goes on to give us an example of one such believer, Barnabas, who sold his field and brought the money from that sale to the apostles' feet. So now we get to chapter 5 of Acts, and it starts with the story of Ananias and Sapphira, which probably is familiar to a number of us. It's a story of a husband and wife who lied to God about the money that they got from selling their house and bringing it to the church. And as a result of lying, they died immediately. So today we're going to look closer at Acts 5, 1-11, but particularly at the role of Sapphira, the wife of Ananias. However, if you want to read the entirety of the passage and get some more context, I would encourage reading from Acts 4:32 all the way to Acts 5:11. So Acts 5:1, it starts off in the ESV with the word "but." So this is a clear indication that the behavior of Ananias and Sapphira is going to be contrasted to that of Barnabas. Chapter 5 starts off by saying, "But a man named Ananias with his wife Sapphira sold a piece of property, and with his wife's knowledge, he kept back for himself some of the proceeds and brought only a part of it and laid it at the apostles' feet." We see Sapphira's first taking the role of a co-conspirator. She was working with her husband, and she was fully aware of what was going on and the plan to sell and then keep back part of that money and not give all of it to the community of believers that they're in. The story goes on where Peter now is tipped off by the Holy Spirit. It doesn't say that specifically, but it is implied because Peter then confronts Ananias first, doesn't ask any questions, but reprimands him for lying to God. With that, Ananias suddenly fell to the ground and died and was carried out to be buried. So 3 hours later, Sapphira comes onto the scene, not knowing what happened with her husband, and now she's questioned by Peter. And that brings us to verse 8 of chapter 5. "And Peter said to her, 'Tell me whether you sold the land for so much.'" So even though they were in collaboration with each other, we see that she was questioned individually, which means that she is held accountable regardless of her husband. Then verse 8 goes on to say, "And she said, 'Yes, for so much.'" Like Sapphira had a chance to come clean, but instead she continues the lie. And in continuing the lie, she's also covering up for her husband because they agreed on this together. And she's kind of like keeping along with the story. Then Peter went on to say, "How is it that you have agreed together to test the Spirit of the Lord?" Here we see the gravity of Sapphira's sin. She is not only showing greed, but she's also sinning against God. She's actually lying to God. In verse 10, we see that immediately she falls down on the ground and takes her last breath. Fittingly, she got the same punishment for the same sin as her husband. The story ends with, "And great fear came upon the whole church, and upon all who heard of these things. The way the story ends really hints to the greater purpose of this event. It's not just to bring judgment to a married couple that was greedy, but it was to have a greater message throughout the church and everyone who would hear this story. And particularly in this story, we see how God is protecting his church. And we will go into that in more detail in a minute. So, as a quick summary, SAPPHIRA's roles in her actions in this story include: 1, she knew about the deception from the beginning and was fully aware of the intent to fake generosity. 2, she was questioned individually and she was held accountable for her own actions. 3, she lied to the Holy Spirit. So now, what can we learn? What can we apply as women from the story of SAPPHIRA? Well, I think it's super duper easy to see what we should not do from this story. So number 1 is to submit to your husband, but not at the point that you are forsaking God. We see in Ephesians 5, wives, submit to your husband as unto the Lord. Now, it's not really quite clear, if it was Ananias' idea or if he coerced her into doing this. But if he did, he was wrong for that. And in her following his lead, she was wrong for that as well. So the lesson to be learned here of what not to do, and the command to submit to your husband, does not extend to the extent of sinning. It should not be submitting to sin under his leadership. This also implies that, we can't be saved by our husbands. We can't hide behind their good works and their ministry when it comes to judgment before God. We are individuals that are accountable to God. Number 2, do not fake it. Try to juggle a lot of balls at the same time, feeling like we need to present an image that we don't necessarily have to. In SAPPHIRA's example, she faked the fact that she was being generous and suffered and was judged for that greatly. But if we think about today in our lives, it's important to not only not fake generosity, but don't fake a struggle. If you think you could get more pity from saying that you struggle with this, that, and the other, and it's not true, don't fake it. Another thing not to fake is ministry. Don't pursue ministry. Don't say you're called to lead a ministry just so that it positions you in a place of power and authority. And lastly, I would say is don't fake generosity. So don't boast and get a lot of pride in giving a lot, especially if it's not to the point where it's actually sacrificial. The last lesson is not a don't do. Instead, it is just an observation, a very humbling observation, is that God will protect his church even if it means removing you from it. This could seem kind of like, We can see from this story that threats to the church don't always come externally. Sometimes they come internally. And in the case in this story, if we think about the individual or the collection of the community being the church and not just the building, honestly, the fact that God pulled Ananias and SAPPHIRA off of this earth did remove them from the church technically, right? Versus if they were outcasts, they could have gone and been a part of another church. What I'm not saying is that if you become a threat to the church, God is going to strike you down and kill you. We usually see protection of the church built into either through eldership, through community and accountability. But it's a very unique situation here because the word church is actually mentioned for the first time in Acts 5, which is what we're reading right now. It's never been mentioned before in Acts. God is making a strong statement by deciding to divinely intervene to protect his church. I believe the statement that he's making is, my church is protected by me, it's holy, and it is authentic. So ladies, do not make these same mistakes. Do not be like SAPPHIRA. And I think I would just want to leave you with one question, which is, what are you faking? Whether it's a reputation you're trying to uphold, if it's something you're pursuing that maybe God is not really calling you to pursue, if it's a relationship you're trying to maintain. What are you faking? If you ladies enjoyed this video, be sure to like it. If you think it can be helpful for someone else, be sure to share it. And if you can't wait to see who the next and the last woman I will feature, be sure to subscribe and turn on your post notifications, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.